books. Welcome back to StoryTube. What's the story? Here's our first wrap up of 2025, wrapping up the month of January.
It was a good month.
It was a very good month.
I think I've officially left my mild slumping in 2024.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we do our wrap ups a little bit differently. It's not exactly January, it's just anything we've read in the interval between our last wrap up and now, pretty much.
Yeah. Will I start?
Absolutely.
Okay. The first book that I read in January, that I read in 2025, was The Given Day by Dennis Lehane. And I will try to be brief with this one because I did actually post a review only a couple of days ago of this entire trilogy. But it's one of my favorite books I have ever read, I believe. Time will tell on this one.
We had one of those months.
We had one of those months, yeah. January is usually a month like that for me. It wasn't last year. So I'm very pleased that we're back to strong starts of the year. But yeah, Dennis Lehane is an author that I discovered last year. Well, I knew of him through you mostly, but I'd never read him until last year. And I loved what I read, and this trend continues, and I now plan to read his entire back catalogue, possibly this year. We'll see. It's ambitious. But
you read my favourite Lehane last year.
Mystic River, yeah. Mm-hmm. The Given Day is a historical fiction, even though he's generally considered a crime and thriller writer. The Given Day is pure historical fiction. It's set in 1919 in Boston, and we're following Danny, who is a cop who is really struggling to make ends meet with the piss poor salary that they pay him. We have themes of class and class solidarity and unions and striking and political unrest and revolutionaries, and where's the line between a legitimate concern and becoming a danger to the people around you. We also throw in the intersection between class and race, and it's very, very interesting. It's wonderfully written. The characters are nuanced and subtly just created as real people. I absolutely fell in love with this story. In fact, I loved it so much that I went straight into the sequel, which is Live by Night. And it's a loose sequel, which is nice because you can read The Given Day as a standalone. And if you want more, you can just keep going. So it's kind of up to you. Live by Night is set 7 years later in 1920s. It's starting in Boston, but also taking place in Tampa, Florida. And we're following a different character. We're following Danny's younger brother, Joe. And it's generally mostly a complete reboot in terms of the cast, but it does give you a little bit extra to know a bit about Joe's past, I suppose. This is pure crime. We have organized crime in the 1920s, bootleggers and flappers, and it's just delicious. I loved it. I don't think it's as thematically rich as The Given Day is, but I think they go extremely well together, and I just love Dennis Lehane. He can do no wrong for now, for me. And that continued to be true when I read the third one, which is World Gone By. And this is a direct sequel to Live by Night. They kind of go together. It's a much smaller scale story, but a great little epilogue to this loose trilogy. Again, like a pretty pure crime story here. And these three books, this trilogy, will go down as one of my favorite trilogies I've ever read. It just does everything that I like in books in terms of just getting attached to characters and falling in love with them and being on the edge of your seat and like really getting into my emotions, but also having a great plot. And I'm not saying in terms of just like an action-packed plot or a fast plot. Actually, The Given Day is quite slow, but just the things that are happening really, really interest me. And on top of that, we have rich themes and wonderful writing that just inspired me to think about loads of things in real life. They're very, very relevant books. I think a lot of the things that Lehane is talking about and writing about that were happening 100 years ago are extremely relevant to some things that are going on in the world today. So that is my short version. If you want some more of my thoughts in a little bit more detail, you can check out my review of the Coughlin trilogy or the Coughlin books, which were my first reads of 2025, and what a way to start the year. I'm very, very pleased to have found something like this again.
Must read that myself. It's a gap in my Dennis Lehane oeuvre. Going from talking about one of my longest favourite writers, Dennis Lehane, into a brand new favourite writer. I will not spend too long on this because I also made a video, but I read 3 books by Percival Everett.
You've been binging a bit in January. I love it.
Yeah, I don't usually do this. Like I said it in the video I made for Percival Everett, I do not usually binge myself, but he is an extraordinary writer, and I ended up doing a sort of impromptu buddy read that wasn't necessarily a buddy read. It was more book swapping with our mate Jimmy from the Fantasy Network. I started off the year reading The Trees when Jimmy was reading James, and we were kind of swapping back and forth. Here's why this book is so amazing. And he convinced me to read James, and when I picked up Erasure and had the same experience, Jimmy also picked up Erasure. So we had a fun month reading some Percival Everett, and I am already reading some more. Very, very briefly, because I'd like people to go watch the Percival Everett video that I made. The Trees is if you take Fargo, dial up the absurdity and satire to 11 and set it in the deep south with heavy themes and looks at racism and the history of America with violence towards black people, specifically lynchings and the KKK and this kind of stuff. The Trees is Percival Everett being angrily hilarious and satirical. Erasure is sort of a book about writing, and the main character is a writer, but Percival Everett, being the self-deprecating, self-aware satirist that he is, makes this book a very, very funny, introspective and layered book. This is about a black author in America who writes very dense, not very palatable, accessible books, not very mainstream, who gets upset that another black author is having huge success as a bestseller because they write what he feels is all of the negative stereotypical black storytelling of negative stereotypes in the hood, all this kind of stuff, and he sets out to write a satire, a piss take of that, basically shoving every negative stereotype and cliche that white publishing wants from black storytelling. He writes this, and you read a good chunk of that novel within the novel, but he ends up, ironically, becoming quite successful with that himself. But for me, the heart of this book is actually his relationship to his family and his sort of evolving relationship with his mother, who has dementia, and his evolving thoughts and recontextualizing thoughts of his father, who is several years dead. There's a lot of emotional and familial complexity in this book, and it's the real heart of it. And I think it might be my favorite of the 3. It's the most layered. But anyway, go watch the video for more of my thoughts on that. And then Jimmy convinced me to read James. This was a book that I wasn't necessarily going to read immediately because I'm not a huge fan of Huckleberry Finn. And this book is a retelling of Huckleberry Finn from Jim's perspective. But this is an amazing book. There is one thing towards the end that I am not super keen on. I don't think it was really necessary, but it doesn't, bring the entire book down. It's just sort of a minor gripe that I have. A bit of a twist on the original tale. So if anybody's read Huckleberry Finn and you go and read this, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about when you get there. But this book is all about the power of language, the power of identity, and the power of controlling your language and your identity. And this, although I am not American, I am not black, and I was never a slave, spoke to me purely based on this sort of idea of people not telling you who you should or how you should identify culturally and how you should speak culturally. The ideas around language and cultural identity and how you control that in how you express yourself. I really love that in this book. So yeah, Percival Everett has immediately cemented himself as one of my favourite writers, and I'm currently reading Wounded by him. That'll be in next month's wrap-up. I'll be reading I Am Not Sidney Poitier. I will probably be reading Dr. No. I will probably be reading those in the next few weeks. That's Percy. Go watch my video. And go watch her Dennis Lehane video.
Yes, do. I also love that you mentioned how Jimmy read Percival Everett with you, but you forgot that I also read Percival Everett with you.
That's right, you read The Trees after.
I did, yeah.
Yeah.
You inspired me to read The Trees because you were going from one to another, and you don't usually do that, so that means something.
Yeah.
And it appealed to me anyway, and I kind of fancied trying something random in January. I really wanted to just mood read and read potential bangers and authors I've been meaning to read, and this was great. I don't have a lot to add to what you said. It's hilarious.
Yeah.
But it doesn't sacrifice any of its bite and its depth with it. But it's extremely readable at the same time. This is such a funny book. It's great. He's an extremely talented writer. I will also be reading more of his this year. I'm actually, out of the ones you haven't read yet that we own, I think Dr. No.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I did genuinely forget that you picked this up because you read it in a day.
Yeah.
It was like one day.
I wasn't reading it for very long.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to segue into the section of this wrap-up that nobody will care about and talk about a couple of books that aren't very interesting for the majority of you, but maybe some of you will care. So, because one of the themes in The Given Day by Dennis Lehane is the beginnings and the early days of anti-communist and anti-anarchist sentiment in America being so close to the Russian Revolution, it made me want to read some nonfiction about it, because the last time I did would have been in school when I studied it, and it's one of my favorite times in history to learn about in school. So I fancied reading some nonfiction. I picked up October by China Mieville. So this is actually my first China Mieville book, and it's his nonfiction, and it's really good. Honestly, there's not that much to say about it. It's nonfiction. I don't really know how to talk about nonfiction or review it or criticize it. I don't read as much of it, but this is quite engaging in how it's written. It is a little bit dense because, I mean, it is history and there are a lot of names and a lot of dates and things going on, but the way it's structured is that it's bringing you from February to October of 1917, and each chapter is like 1 month in that year and what's going on in the revolution. And it made me want to pick up his fantasy, which, I mean, I wanted to anyway, but now he's really, really high on my list for fantasy. So I'm excited about that. Then I reread Deutschland ein Wintermärchen by Heinrich Heine. This is a long poem. I mean, long for a poem. It's like a 80-page book or something by Heinrich Heine, who is a German poet, and he wrote it in 1844, I believe, the mid-19th century anyway, and he lived in exile in Paris, and this poem is about him returning on a trip to Germany. And I read it for the first time 11 or 12 years ago when I was 18, and I remember liking it, but I don't remember picking up on anything specific about it. I just enjoyed reading it. And this time, I think I picked up on a bit more, just, you know, being a bit older and having a bit more experience. And the part that resonated with me the most is just this idea of coming back to a country that you are from, that maybe you haven't been to in a while, and he clearly misses it and loves it, but also harbors some resentment, and there's a bit of snark and sarcasm in there. It's quite funny at times, but also wistful and very beautiful, and I really like that aspect of it. It was nice to reread. So that's German poetry. And then I also read Darth Vader by Greg Pak, Volume 10. which is finishing Greg Pak's run on Darth Vader in comics. So if you've been following along the last year or two, I've been reading every Darth Vader comic ever published, and I have now accomplished that. And this one is actually the first one I started, but it's the most recent one that's come out, and it's set between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. It's the longest one, 10 volumes, I think, like 50 issues. I think that's really cool. I do think the first half of the run was better, like all of his ideas are in there, and then we get a little bit repetitive. But I don't mind because I still have a great time with it. So this volume didn't like blow me away or anything, but it did have some very nice parts to it. There's a Phantom Menace special anniversary kind of issue at the very end, which kind of helps end this run, and I really liked that. It was nice. So yeah, Darth Vader, Russian history, and German poetry. There you go. Back to the fiction.
We're not going back to the fiction, actually.
Oh, shit.
We're going to talk about some non-fiction.
Never mind.
And an essential work of non-fiction. This is Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber. One of the best non-fiction books I think I've read. I wish this book had come out when I was doing my master's. A little bit about me. I did a master's in work psychology. I specialized a lot in psychological behavior in the workplace and like building trust and sort of leadership and these kinds of ideas and the psychological theories behind them, not the bullshit corporate trainings that companies send you on. I did a lot of research into this. I did a lot of reading about this, and this is me coming back to this area of research after quite a number of years. I wish this book had been written when I was doing my thesis. A lot of the stuff in this book puts into words how many of us feel in the workplace, especially post-industrialization and a lot of services, the corporate services jobs, not like service as in hospitality or customer service. This is more, those bullshit jobs.
Jobs that were, if everybody stopped doing them, nothing would happen to the world.
Yeah, have you ever felt that if your job ceased to exist, that anything at all would be different? He kind of separates out, he develops a theory throughout the book, he develops a framework as you go through the book, through mainly a lot of qualitative research. So there's a lot of testimonies he gets from people of the types of bullshit jobs and why they exist. He talks about duct tapers, task managers, box tickers, goons. He talks about kind of the emotional and psychological ramifications of modern working life and why people are depressed and feeling purposelessness. It's just a book that speaks to me and to the experience of billions of people on a very profound and fundamental level. He can be a little hand-wavy and simplistic on economic systems and political systems, sort of grander ideas. He's a bit simplistic about ideas of socialism. He himself identifies as an anarchist. There's a little bit of painting socialism and communism with the exact same brush, and I don't necessarily agree there. I think it's a lot more complex than that. But he also presents some ideas that are quite socialist, so I don't really know where David Graeber really lies himself. A bit anarchist of him, actually. But like I said, it's just a book that I wish was published when I was doing my own research for my own thesis in quite a similar area, to be honest. It's a work mostly of cultural criticism. The way he is going about criticizing societal practices is just giving voice to an exasperation and an outrage that I feel at people who just accept bullshit societal practices just because it's the way things are, or that's how it is in the real world. Shut up and get on with it and accept it. I hate this line of thinking because it's just a fact that many people are very miserable, and we do have a global epidemic of depression, anxiety, and people feeling worthless. And where do we find meaning, because maybe a soulless, completely pointless job is sucking every ounce of energy out of you, and your meaning could be gotten elsewhere. So you could do a job that's perhaps quite easy and still beneficial to someone, and have more time in your daily life to pursue things that are also important: art, culture, hobbies, spending time with family, building social relationships. There's a lot of talk about isolation and how people withdraw into themselves when they're in these situations of bullshit jobs. And why do we as a society pay and reward authority figures that have a bullshit job more than people who really do essential humanitarian work? Healthcare being the number one thing. But even just ideas of people cleaning, one of the most essential and overlooked professions in the world, cleaners. Why is it such a societal stigma about having a career like that? Why do people put so much personal identity over a, arbitrary position of success that doesn't really make much sense, and somebody can't take pride in keeping something clean? So I think Bullshit Jobs is an absolutely essential read for pretty much anybody, but especially anyone completing a business degree, a work-related sort of management degree. It will help future task managers to not be so micromanagey. It would open people's eyes, I think. I mean, there were a couple of sentences that entirely described my 2024. If you've been following the channel, you know I lost my job last year through a variety of very arbitrary bullshit reasons in a job that I feel shouldn't have existed in the first place. There's a lot in here that I'm sure staunch free market capitalist heads will pick apart and go, where's your quantitative data to back up this point? But the fact of the matter is, a lot of people are really fucking miserable in modern working life. And why is that? What is behind the cultures in workplaces that make your middle manager want to track every single thing that you do from 9 to 5 Monday to Friday? If you get your tasks done, if you get your work done on a Wednesday, why do you have to pretend to look busy on Thursday and Friday, and everybody's in on the charade, but your manager might be poking you? Why do we do that? This book kind of discusses a lot of this. And then he also, presents a lot of interesting ideas. He goes back to history and he compares, working in the Middle Ages, when there's ideas about like bursts of work, where people would do bursts of work and then take quite a long time off. And this was how many people worked for millennia. The idea of why have we continued to implement the 9 to 5, Monday to Friday for PR jobs, these kinds of jobs that shouldn't be necessary but are, and how this is just a modern invention and an accepted form of society, and the notion of time theft, and why is this a thing? And he also presents sort of future ideas as well, of like a universal basic income, what that would look like, how one could implement it. He doesn't go super in depth about it, but I think just on a profound fundamental level about just behavior in the workplace, this could not be speaking my language anymore. I think if you feel a little disillusioned with where you are in life or in your career, and you want to think a little bit more about like, my career does not define me as a human being, read this book. It will make you angry in parts, but it will just be sort of reaffirming how you feel. And there is a sense of hope in there, but we need more people to be thinking like this to actually make some change. So I think it's an important book, and I would like people to read it. Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber.
Two more things I read in January. This one's pretty quick, and that is Foster by Claire Keegan. I read this in an afternoon. Should have done it a lot sooner, and I loved it. So I had read Small Things Like These, which is her novel. I think that's actually novel length. This is more of a novella. And I'd also read So Late in the Day, both of which I thought were very competently written and ultimately fine. They didn't get me on an emotional level, and I didn't really understand what the huge hype around Claire Keegan was or is. If you don't know, especially in Ireland, Claire Keegan is the hottest thing in literary fiction, in Irish fiction. Certainly everybody's reading her here, everybody's talking about her. We sold so many of her books on a daily basis all the time, but I just thought maybe she's not for me. I don't know if I get it, and I finally read Foster, and now I get it. I think there are two camps of people who think Small Things Like These is better, and people who think that Foster is better.
Foster is better.
And I think it just depends on your own like background and context. For me, Foster is better. Foster hit harder. It's a very simple story, extremely well told. And her writing style, which is very subtle and saying most of what she wants to say through what she doesn't say. And that really fits the theme of this book, which is about a young girl who goes to spend the summer with her aunt and uncle as a foster child. And she doesn't speak very much, but she doesn't have to. And a big theme of the book is, appreciating silence and not having to fill it all the time if there's no need for it, not having to speak if you don't have anything nice to say. And it just suits the way Claire Keegan writes. It's very short and it says a lot, and it really got me in the feels with its last page. I loved it. I could not recommend it enough, and it's really, really short, so you can sit down and read it in like an hour. Like the font size is huge. An hour well spent, I would say. And then I'll talk about another one really quickly, and that is She's Always Hungry by Eliza Clark. So I read Boy Parts and Penance last year. Love both of them. And I think Eliza Clark is a new favourite author that I'll just be picking up whatever she publishes. And this is her latest. It's a short story collection. I think it's 10 stories that are in it. And I read it early in January. Like any short story collection that I've read, there's highs and lows. The lows weren't very low and the highs were very high. So this is a great short story collection overall. I do find that there are a handful of stories, maybe like 3, maybe 4, that I remember quite vividly and that immediately come to mind when I think of this collection. And then there are others that blend together a little bit. She does cross from general fiction and hot girl fiction, if you want to consider that a genre, into a little bit of sci-fi in this one. I believe a lot of people would probably call it speculative fiction in this case, which I thought was interesting. Maybe not my favorite of hers. I think I like her when she's more grounded generally, although there's one of the stories here that is sci-fi and a bit dystopian that has some of my favorite lines I've read. Really enjoyed my time with it. Like with any Eliza Clark, she's just such a great writer. She's so refreshing to read. Just a very, very distinctive voice. I do think I prefer her novels over her short stories for now in general, but still, really good book.
Next one I won't spend too long on because I also made a review video, kind of overview of the whole trilogy of 4 books. But I read the 4th book in that trilogy, which is the second half of To Green Angel Tower, in the last month. And in December I'd read part 1, which I thought was amazing. And part 2, my God, really dragged. went in circles, a lot of repetitive stuff, but the ending was really good. Overall, I really like the trilogy. I don't necessarily think I love the trilogy. I love the first book, and I love parts of The Green Angel Tower. But my God, is this too long? It's too long. It is too long. I think it's fair to say that he's a tad bit wordy. Unnecessarily so, because there's a lot of scenes that just sort of double up and serve the same function, and yes, we understand, I get the idea. And my one prevailing sentiment towards the end was Tad was just trying to convince me and himself that this is all more complex than it actually is, but it is still well worth a read because you can see the lineage of fantasy in this, and you can see the influence on modern fantasy. You can even see the influence on George R. R. Martin, who himself credits Tad Williams as an influence on himself. But there's a lot that I think George just perfected. However, as well, the main thing coming out of this is that I feel like The Last King of Ostenard, the follow-up books, and maybe the novellas that sort of go in between, there's one prequel, are gonna be my cup of tea with Tad. They're gonna be the Tad books that I really, really like. This feels like one really long prologue to a more interesting story. I think early on as well, I was, fairly unimpressed with the world. It's Western Europe, and very blatantly so. There's some cool use of language and little nods to Irish specifically, a lot of Irish in it. But again, it all feels a little stale. But I think if you're in any way a fantasy fan, if you're a fantasy super fan, you gotta read Tad Williams because he is a very influential author, and you will see a lot of the foundations of what you love in here. And he's just a perfect bridge between Tolkien and modern fantasy.
My next read of the month was Eurotrash by Christian Kracht, who is a Swiss writer writing in German. I read it in German, but it is translated into English if you're interested. It's a relatively new release.
That would be Eurotrash by Christian Kracht.
There you go. This was a really interesting book. So, as far as I understand, it's somewhat autobiographical in the auto-fiction sphere, and it's about the main character wrestling with mostly his relationship with his mother, but specifically through the lens of wrestling with his mother's family ties to the Nazi regime. His mother's old, she's in her 80s, and he takes her on a bit of a road trip around Switzerland, and we get dialogue between them and then interspersed with little bits of memory from him from all over the place. It's not very linear in that regard. Kind of the core concept is his mother is very, very rich, and he starts trying to give her money away because he considers it to be unethical money. But it's not as easy as he thought it might be. And I thought that was a very interesting concept, and it is. The execution was a bit different than I expected because I thought that was like the hook of the novel, but that's just, it's very literary in that sense. It's more about just the themes, but also like the dialogue between the characters, and I wouldn't say that them trying to give away their money is like the plot. There's not much plot. But it's a very interesting book. It's a bit of a snapshot of someone's mind, I think I would describe it as, and reminded me a little bit of Will and Testament by Vigdis Hjorth in that regard. Different like theme and like different character, but this non-linear piecing bits of somebody's memory together, trying to make sense of your own family history and how that family history is tied to the place that you're from and what that means for you and what unspoken resentments live within your home and that kind of thing. And I thought that was really interesting. I don't think it's a perfect book for me. I feel like maybe it held me a little bit at arm's length in terms of like really getting close to the character emotionally. Not sure why that is really, but it was a really interesting book to read. I found that I was reading it quite slowly generally because it was jumping around so much and I wanted to stop to digest what was being written about, what was being said, and like to remember and situate myself and see where I was. It's quite funny at times. I think I enjoyed that the most. There's a bit of wit in there and some situations that are just really bizarre and a little bit like dialed to 11 just to give you a shock, I suppose. It's a good book. It's a really interesting book, unlike anything else I read this month, and it kind of stood out for that reason.
And the last book I read is a book that I've owned for over a decade, but finally decided to read it now because I was motivated to after there's now 2 seasons of a television show based on it. It's Wool by Hugh Howey. Silo on Apple TV is based on this book, and I figured, well, I should probably finally read this book. And there are aspects of this book that I think are a little, better, more interesting. But overall, I think the show did a better job of telling this story. However, I really like Hugh Howey's writing style. There's some really cool flow to his prose, and a sort of a, if you know anything about it, it's like 10,000 people living in an underground silo in a sort of post-apocalyptic setting, and they don't know why they're in the silo, they can't leave, and there's basically a stratified society and a sort of a class system from, the up top to the down deep. We mainly follow Juliet, who is one of the heads of mechanical, and her prose, where her narration, Hugh Howey writes her with this sort of mechanical metaphor, and everything is like, this is just hard as steel. That's a very basic one, but that kind of thing. But this was originally published as a series of like short stories and novellas that is put together as one book. But this does read as one cohesive narrative, just with chapters from different perspectives. And it's really good. This is a really fun book. Don't think about the logistics and the plot too hard because it might start to fall apart. But it's a very fun read. And, there's some really interesting stuff in there about class as well. And how, humans just inevitably form this oppressive hierarchy of control and anarchy when things go wrong. It's a little abrupt at times, and kind of the movement from plot beat to plot beat is a little jarring and underdeveloped, which is weird because it's quite a long book. And I think the show improves on that by sort of fleshing out certain characters, certain plot lines, and giving stuff some room to breathe, so it's a little more seamless. However, in doing so, the show sometimes writes itself into some silly situations where it feels manufactured just for, like, manipulating some dramatic tension. It feels artificial in that sense. The book doesn't really suffer from that. The book just suffers from a few of those plot lines being underdeveloped and moving along kind of in a choppy fashion. But that's probably just the novella thing creeping in. Other than that, this is a really fun book, and I'm glad I finally read it. It's a very popular work of sci-fi in the last 15 years or so, yeah.
That sounds like my cup of tea.
Yes.
Yeah.
Revolution.
Well, we have arrived at my last read of the last month. And ladies and gentlemen,
you read a lot.
I did. I had a great month. I had not read an adult fantasy since May of last year. So that's 9 months ago now. It's February. And I finally came back to adult fantasy. And it's not a reread, shockingly. So I read Babel by R.F. Kuang. So I'd never read R.F. Kuang before, even though I bought all of her books. We have The Poppy War, then I bought this because look at how pretty it is. and I bought Yellowface because there was a signed edition in the bookshop, and I just like bought it. I have a problem. So it was time to finally read her books because all of her premises really appeal to me, and she seems to be controversial. Like her opinions on her books are quite mixed most of the time. People love them or hate them. So I always found that interesting. Yeah. And Babel is the one that appeals to me the most. So that's the one I started with. I just think that the concept of magic tied to translation and language is really, really interested. And I am kind of a nerd about that stuff. So I thought that was a very cool idea. And it has a dark academia vibe set in like a slightly magical version of 19th century Oxford. I like the 19th century. So a lot of elements in here that sound like really up my alley. For about 250 pages, this book was really up my alley. Like the prose was doing it for me. The concept of the magic was doing it for me. The dark academia was working. It was just felt so delicious to read. And then unfortunately, she made the least interesting decision at every crossroad in terms of plot, in terms of character, in terms of thematic depth. If you don't know, this is aiming to be a bit of a metaphor through magic and through that magic of translation for the Industrial Revolution and specifically for British colonialism. And through it, it's examining specifically racism is what the book is most focused on. I would say almost exclusively focused on. And all of that is really interesting. And I think that if she were to sit down and pitch this to me, I would think it's a great idea. But in the execution, unfortunately, I found that it fell apart a little bit. I found her approach to oppression, to revolution, to class issues, to race issues, to colonialism, to everything that she's talking about to be very unfortunately simplistic. She paints large groups and individuals with the same brush. So my problem is not so much to say colonialism is bad. Yeah, I think that's a pretty clear-cut issue. But to then go into individual characters and have them all behave in way A or way B, depending on what side of that they fall on, I just don't think that's a realistic approach. I also just don't think it's an interesting approach. And it makes the book a lot more boring. And it's a disservice to a story that set out to be interesting and to be unique. And it ended up being none of that, which is just very unfortunate. I'll probably do a review on it to expand on my thoughts because there's a lot to say and I think it's an interesting book to discuss, both because of what it sets out to do and also because it kind of fails to do that, I believe. So more thoughts to come on that. But that was my last read of the month. What was your book of the month?
Oh, God. Well, it would be between the three Percys and Bullshit Jobs.
Is that like 60% of what you read?
Yeah. Maybe Erasure and Bullshit Jobs. Or maybe James. Or maybe The Trees. And Bullshit Jobs. Percy and Bullshit Jobs.
This is 6 honorable mentions all over again.
Yeah. What was your book of the month?
The Given Day by Dennis Lehane.
Great, that was easy.
Yeah.
Well, let's wrap this up because that was a very long time. So if you like this video, give it a like. If you have read any of the books that we've read, if you have more thoughts on them that we didn't say, comment down below. But also comment down below what you read in the last month or so. Do you have anything to say before we say goodbye?
No, thank you so much for watching. We'll chat to you in the comments as always. And I hope that you also had a good start to the year in terms of reading. And if you didn't, I hope that your reads pick up in February.
Fresh starts, fresh reads. See you later. Goodbye.
Bye.